Good morning, it's Pastor Marshall again here on Sunday morning, 28th of June. Glad you can join us here. Laidley Baptist Church, we're deep in the Bap Cave. We're continuing our series in Zechariah. We're into chapter 11 today. That's what we're going to look at. There's a lot of interesting things in chapter 11. For example, it talks about 30 pieces of silver. It talks about shepherds. It talks about the two different shepherds. And Zechariah, of course, is a book of prophecy. 14 chapters. We've been doing one chapter a week. This week, today, we're doing chapter 11. It's called The Two Shepherds. What are those two shepherds and what do they mean? And when we read this, what does it all mean? Of course, this series has been a challenge on my heart as a pastor, and it matches this theme that comes from verse 3 in chapter 1. Return to me and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty. And so we're into that theme of knowing that the times around us are just crazy, but at the same time, knowing that God is in control. He's calling each one of us in these end times to return to Him. That's our theme through these past 10 or 11 weeks as we've started and looked at the prophet, the minor prophet Zechariah. There's a whole heap of screens that I'm just going to flick through. They're all in our previous podcasts. They explain a little bit about the backstory of Zechariah in terms of the fact that he was a minor prophet that came after Israel had been exiled. After 70 years, they returned to build the temple, and we're looking at Zechariah's near and distant prophecies. Some of them have been fulfilled. We've looked at that over previous podcasts, but we're going to look at, over the next three or four chapters, those that are yet to be fulfilled. Today we'll also talk about some of Zechariah's near prophecies that were fulfilled in AD 70 with the Romans coming into Jerusalem and burning both the temple and Jerusalem to the ground. Let's, as I flick through these screens, you can probably read them on your own, they're behind me, but feel free to go to our YouTube podcasts. Just look up Laidley Baptist Church, you'll find them all there on this series. Today, chapter 11 finishes the first burden of the word of Jehovah. It's the third part of the four parts in Zechariah. Next week we're on the last little bit of Zechariah, we start chapter 12. And it gets really interesting because next week we look at the campaigns of Armageddon. And I'm sure you're all interested in those during the end times. So today we finish this first burden, Jehovah's word, called the Two Shepherds of Israel. Let's go and let's listen to that Bible reading now. It's 17 verses and feel free to follow along. Let's go and do that right now. Zechariah chapter 11, verse 1. Open your doors, Lebanon, so that fire may devour your cedars. Wail, you juniper, for the cedar has fallen. The stately trees are ruined. Wail, oaks of Bashan. The dense forest has been cut down. Listen to the wail of the shepherds. Their rich pastures are destroyed. Listen to the roar of the lions. The lush thicket of the Jordan is ruined. The two shepherds. Verse 4. This is what the Lord my God says. Shepherd the flock marked for slaughter. Their buyers slaughter them and go unpunished. Those who sell them say, Praise the Lord, I am rich. Their own shepherds do not spare them. For I will no longer have pity on the people of the land, declares the Lord. I will give everyone into the hands of their neighbours and their king. They will devastate the land, and I will not rescue anyone from their hands. So I shepherded the flock marked for slaughter, particularly the oppressed of the flock. Then I took two staffs and called one favour and the other union, and I shepherded the flock. In 1 month I got rid of the three shepherds. The flock detested me, and I grew weary of them and said, I will not be your shepherd. Let the dying die and the perishing perish. Let those who are left eat one another's flesh. Then I took my staff called favour and I broke it, revoking the covenant I had made with all the nations. It was revoked on that day, and so the oppressed of the flock, who were watching me, knew it was the word of the Lord. I told them, If you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, Throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they valued me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them to the potter at the house of the Lord. Then I broke my second staff called union, breaking the family bond between Judah and Israel. Then the Lord said to me, Take again the equipment of a foolish shepherd, for I am going to raise up a shepherd over the land who will not care for the lost or seek the young, or heal the injured or feed the healthy, but will eat the meat of the choice sheep, tearing off their hooves. Woe to the worthless shepherd who deserts the flock. May the sword strike his arm and his right eye. May his arm be completely withered, his right eye totally blinded. Zechariah chapter 11. It's essentially, if you were to give it a title, it'd be called not only Two Shepherds, but the other title for it is The Rejection of the True Shepherd. And so today, chapter 11 deals with two different types of shepherds over the nation of Israel. You know, we talked about the true shepherd, the one which Israel ultimately rejected when the Messiah came, when Jesus, Yeshua, arrived in his first coming. That was the true shepherd and how Israel rejected him. But then we're also going to talk about the foolish shepherd, the false teachers, the false leaders and prophets of Israel that basically lead Israel down the path of destruction. But God gives Zechariah two roles. He first plays Zechariah in the role of the true Messiah. Then he plays Zechariah in the role of the false Messiah or the false prophet to give us an idea of what's going to occur in the future. We're going to start first of all because he opens in the first three verses with this discourse about the devastation of the land. And he discusses the rejection of the true shepherd as he begins to describe the devastation that comes as a result of rejecting that true shepherd, the true Messiah. So he focuses first in the first verse and in the first part of verse 2 on Lebanon. Now Lebanon, most of us know from not only biblical history but also current history that Lebanon is famous for its cedar trees. And as a result, it says also there that the juniper or the fir tree was told to wail because the cedar has fallen and the stately or goodly ones are destroyed. Now often, I'm not sure if you've picked this up, but if you've looked at the Jewish temple as it was built, and in Zechariah's time it was in the midst of being built, but it had wonderful floors and walls of beautiful cedar timber. And so the Jewish temple is often described as the place of cedar or the house of cedar. And that's mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 5, verses 5 to 6. Now what he's doing here is he's concentrating all of his thinking on the Jewish temple, pointing out that this Jewish temple, even now, as it's going up, as it's being built, is seen as the house of cedar, but one day it will be destroyed. And that's what verses 1 and 2 are referring to. In the second part of verse 2, he focuses on the land of Bashan, which is today partially in the Golan Heights. And he says, "Wail, oaks of Bashan, the dense forest has been cut down. So Bashan should weep because the mighty cedar of Lebanon has also fallen." So he's talking about this devastation that's coming. And so in verse 3 we have the wailing of the shepherds. And in those days he's referring to the Jewish leaders. The reason for the wailing is for the glory has been destroyed. Their rich pastures have been destroyed. What they know during the good times is going to be destroyed. And so when Jerusalem and the temple is destroyed, their glory also is destroyed. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem is the cause for the wailing of these shepherds referred to in verse 3. Finally, he focuses on the Jordan Valley. For those of you who have been to Israel, you know that the Jordan Valley is this lush, thick thickets, bushes, very green, very lush around the River Jordan as it weaves its way down the middle of the nation or the land of Israel. But the lush thickets in this valley of the Jordan Valley as you might know it, the pride of the Jordan, is mentioned also in Jeremiah 3 times. In Jeremiah 12 verse 5, Jeremiah 49 verse 19 and also Jeremiah 50 verse 44. And so he's focusing on these things that are going to be destroyed, that everything is going to be throughout this land be brought down and devastated. And so this devastation in these first 3 verses is a devastation that is fulfilled in AD 70 by the Roman Empire as they come in. We'll talk more about that in just a second. The next couple of verses, as we look at the next 10 verses or so, we're looking at the rejection of the true shepherd, and we'll have a look at a number of things during these 10 or 11 verses. So having described what's going to occur in these first 3 verses, the total devastation of the land of Israel from one end to the other, especially the temple, he describes the reason for this destruction, and it is the rejection of the true shepherd. So he discusses the reason, and he begins his account in verse 4 through to verse 6 with a commission to Zechariah as the prophet. In verse 4, the emphasis is on the flock. Zechariah refers to him as the Lord my God. He's referring to his own personal God. It's a sort of a bit of a play on words that we miss, because in fact Israel has not taken God as their God. His commission, as God gives it to him, is to feed the flock of slaughter. To feed the slaughtered flock. Now in this context, the flock of slaughter refers to Israel as a whole nation. And it's a flock that's already destined for destruction. God has made that decision. And the destruction will be by the imperial empire of Rome, in keeping with the prophecy of these first 3 verses in the year AD 70. Then he goes on in verses 5 to 6 and he describes the condition of the flock. And he mentions 2 things about the flock. The 2 things that he mentions is that they have been abandoned by man. Verse 5 talks about that their buyers slaughter them and go unpunished. Now in the context of fulfillment, the buyers or the possessors are the Romans, who slew the Jews but didn't feel any guilt about it. Their own Jewish leaders didn't even have any pity on them, because it said in verse 5, their own shepherds and leaders did not spare them. So the Jewish leaders sold out their people, the Jewish people. They sold them out in order so that they could become rich. So the flock has been abandoned by man first of all, but secondly abandoned by God. It says, therefore, I will no longer have pity on the people of the land, says God in verse 6. God will remove his mercy, and he does that for a reason. He removes his mercy in order that the fulfillment of verses 1 to 3 can occur. And then he says, I will give everyone into the hands of their neighbours. And so he's dealing with the strife that comes in AD 70. Now, if you've read much of the history around the fall of the Jewish nation underneath the Roman Empire, you'll know that the first Jewish uprising, the first Jewish revolt, started around about 66 AD. And as it progressed through, there was these different uprisings that occurred. But over time, all of the different Jewish sects and zealots and all the different groups started to have infighting. And they fought against each other, even destroying each other's food supplies, which actually led to their starvation during the siege by the Roman Empire. But he then mentions that he will give every man to his king. Now, when we look at John's Gospel in chapter 19, and we have a look at verse 15, there's people at Jesus' trial, they're crying out, we have no king but Caesar. The point is that if Caesar is your king, that you will be delivered into the hand of your king. That's what he's referring to right here. And of course we know that the Jews were delivered into the hand of Caesar, the one in charge of the Roman Empire at that time. So he says that they will devastate the land, described already in the first 3 verses of Zechariah chapter 11. He says, I will not rescue anyone from their hands, says God. There will be no deliverance. That God won't rescue them from the hand of the Romans when that fall comes in AD 70. Now, if you look at that first war, that first Roman war between the Jews and the Romans, the ultimate result of all of that was that 1,100,000 Jews were killed and 97,000 Jews were taken away into slavery or into captivity. And in these verses of chapter 11, verses 4 to 6, Zechariah was told to play the role of the Messiah, that the Messiah will someday play, to feed a flock destined for slaughter. So then Zechariah carries out the commission that God has given him. These are the next couple of verses, the next 4 or 5 verses. Zechariah was told, as I said, to play that role that the Messiah would someday play, that role of the Good Shepherd, the role of the true shepherd. And in verse 7, we're told that Zechariah did the feeding of the flock marked for slaughter. And he did minister to all of Israel. But he then mentions that the poor and oppressed of the flock. And so you've got to ask the question, well, who are the poor and the oppressed of the flock? And while the ministry was made to the flock as a whole, there was this special emphasis on the poor or the oppressed. And that ministry was going to go out to these ones who were poor and oppressed. That segment of the flock that accepted who God was, the remnant, those believers, the believing remnant of Israel. So the flock of slaughter as a whole are the people of Israel, and the poor of the flock, or the oppressed, are the believing remnant of Israel, sometimes referred to as the Israel of God. And we see the fulfillment of this in Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 to 36. Now, to carry out this particular commission that God had given to Zechariah, he carried 2 staffs, like a shepherd's crook, a shepherd's staff. And he gave them 2 names. Now, it depends on which translation you're reading, but they're called beauty and bands in some translations. In other translations, they're referred to as favour and union. Same thing. But the Hebrew word here for the first one, for beauty or favour, means graciousness, or God's graciousness. And the purpose of this first staff is for the protection, the graciousness of God. The other staff is called union or bands, and the Hebrew word that's used there is binding. And so the purpose of the second staff was to keep the flock together, to bind them together, to unite them. So it emphasises unity of the flock. And he says that he shepherded and fed the flock. And so Zechariah's flock was fed and his commission was fulfilled. He hadn't failed in fulfilling what God had commanded him to do. Then in verse 8, he talks of the destruction of the other shepherds. And he mentions that he destroys 3 shepherds in 1 month. And so what are these 3 shepherds and how are they destroyed in 1 month? Let's have a look at that. So the question is, who are they? Some see these shepherds as being the priests, the scribes and the elders. Others see them as the civil authorities, the priests and the false prophets. Others again see them as lawyers or Sadducees and Pharisees. But in keeping with the context in the New Testament, this whole prophecy that's yet to come, yet to happen, then it's believed that these 3 shepherds are the Pharisees, the Sadducees and the scribes. Basically those leaders who rejected the first coming of the Messiah. Now the reason Zechariah had to decree judgment against them was because of their mutual antagonism. They just fought with each other. They hated each other. They led Israel astray. But he says that his soul, Zechariah's soul, was weary of them. And his weariness of them is seen in the denunciation of the leaders. We see that in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 23, verses 1 to 37. Their success in bribing Judas to betray Jesus, and then the actual carrying out of his death, the crucifixion and his trial, etc., leading up to that. However, for a while he did fulfill his commission, and he fed the flock, and he used these 2 staffs to protect them and to keep the flock together, to cut off these 3 types of rulers. Nevertheless, in verse 9, there came a cessation to the feeding. Zechariah's ministry of caring and protecting the flock would finish, because he says at that point in verse 9, he says, "I will not be your shepherd." And at some point the feeding stopped as far as the nation as a whole, the nation of Israel as a whole is concerned. At some point there was a rupture or a separation as the good shepherd from the people. So he ended the feeding in order to leave them to their natural course of events. That judgment that was coming, Zechariah leaves them to whatever's going to occur, because he says, "Let the dying die and the perishing perish. Let those who are left eat one another's flesh." And this was fulfilled during the siege against Jerusalem. In verse 10, he breaks one of the staffs. He breaks that very first staff that we talked about, that staff called beauty or favour. And at this point, God's grace and protection is broken. God's protection is removed from the nation of Israel. God's favour is removed. And he mentions that the covenant with the Gentile, all the nations, whenever the Bible says all the nations, it means the Gentiles. He mentions that the covenant with the Gentiles is broken. What is that covenant? What is the covenant that's broken here? The covenant is a covenant that says that they cannot harm Israel until God allows it. So now the Gentiles are allowed to actually hurt the nation of Israel. And the fulfillment of this is recorded in Luke's Gospel, chapter 19, verse 41 to 44, and also in Luke 21, verse 24. This rupture, the breaking of God's favour and grace, was fulfilled in Matthew 12, 22 to 45. Now, I don't know if you know that story in Matthew 12, but it's at that point that the leaders of the nation of Israel, the religious leaders, those who were the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, etc., rejected the messiahship of Jesus on the basis that they concluded that he was demon-possessed. Now, at this point, there is this major rupture. And at that point, Jesus pronounces the leaders are guilty of the unpardonable sin. The unpardonable sin at this point in time here is the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit by the nation's leaders, Israel's religious leaders at that time. If you want to know more about that, jump on our website, our church website, go under Q&A, under some of the questions there, and there's a question in there that asks that very question. What is the unpardonable sin? And you'll see a good explanation there. So please go and do that. So at this time, or at this point, he tells them because of their rejection of the Messiah, that they're subject now to God's divine judgment. That comes in AD 70. And at that point, God's grace and God's protection is removed from Israel. We see, as I've got on the screen here, the fulfillment there in Matthew 12, the rejection of the messiahship of Jesus. In verse 11, he describes the effects of these actions on those who are the believing remnant, the poor and the oppressed of the flock. He says, it was revoked on that day, and so the oppressed of the flock who were watching me knew it was the word of the Lord. So the ones who were poor, the Jewish believers, that remnant, and often in Isaiah, for example, they're referred to, the believing remnant is referred to as the poor and the needy. And this is a reference to the believing remnant of Israel. And so the Jewish believers recognized that what Jesus did in Matthew chapter 12 was the word of Jehovah, and that they would now act accordingly. And so these are the ones who did heed to Jesus, and they did believe in him. There's a lot of things happened around about this time, and as we look at the first Jewish revolt, let me fill you in on a couple of things that did occur. So we know that this was fulfilled. All of the remnant, the believers, the Jewish believers, escaped to a place called Pella. And in Luke 21, verse 20 to 21, Jesus warned these believers, the Jewish believers, that when they saw Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that they were not to take up weapons to help defend the city. But when they see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, this was a sign. It was a sign that Jerusalem would ultimately be destroyed. It was a sign that the judgment for their leaders committing the unpardonable sin was about to be fulfilled. And this was a sign that the effects of the breaking of that first staff, that staff called beauty or favour, was about to take place. God's judgment was coming. His graciousness and protection had been removed, and they were not to defend the city, but abandon it and leave it and head to the mountains. Now, the Jewish believers, when they did see what was going on, the armies surrounding Jerusalem, they knew what was going to happen. They did recognize it to be the word of the Lord, the word of God. And so when this Jewish revolt against the Romans in AD 66 broke out, the then Roman general, a guy called Cestius Gallus, brought legions of soldiers out of Rome, and he surrounded the city, and the Jewish believers took that to be that sign, that Luke 21 verse 20 to 21 sign. And they knew that they had to leave the city, but while the Romans were besieging it, leaving the city was impossible. However, this Roman general, Cestius Gallus, realised that his supply lines were being cut and he couldn't secure them. And so this revolt was more widespread than, it was not just a local revolt. And so Jerusalem, he was temporarily forced to sort of back off and to lift the siege of Jerusalem. And on his way back away from Jerusalem, he was killed by Jewish forces as they attacked him. So temporarily at least, Jerusalem was no longer under a siege. And it was during this time that the Jewish believers took the opportunity to abandon the city and fulfill the statement that's made in this verse, that the poor of the flock who took heed of me knew that it was the word of God. And they knew it to be the word of God. All of these things were coming true around them. And so they abandoned Jerusalem. They abandoned the second temple to its destruction. They all went to Pella. And even though 1,100,000 Jews were killed and 97,000 were taken into slavery, not one Jewish believer lost their lives in that war. Not one of the remnant, not one of those poor and oppressed that Zechariah is talking about here lost their life. Not one Jewish believer at that time went into slavery. So let's look at the last little section now. We're going to have a look now at what does it cost. He talks now about these 30 pieces of silver, the price of a good shepherd in verses 12 to 14. The price of the good shepherd. So in verses 12 to 14, he concludes this section with the price of the good shepherd. And verse 12 deals with the attitude of the Jewish leaders. Zechariah is pictured as appearing before the leaders, and he says this. He says, "If you think it best or good, give me my pay. But if not, keep it." In other words, since we did not agree to a price in advance, pay me what you think that I'm worth. If my work proved good to you, then give me what it's worth. But if not, give me nothing. So guess what they did? They paid Zechariah 30 pieces of silver. Now that number of pieces of silver comes up again. Later in the Gospels, we see that Jesus is basically bribed or sold. There's a transaction that occurs between Judas and the leaders, the temple leaders at that time. Zechariah was paid 30 pieces of silver. Let me tell you, it was not a compliment. The 30 pieces of silver at that time is a symbol, it was a sign of contempt, and it goes all the way back. It originates in Exodus chapter 21, verse 32, which says that if your ox as the owner of an ox or a bull, gored to death your neighbour's slave, then you're obligated to pay your neighbour the amount of 30 pieces of silver. So that was the value of the price of a dead slave. Then, if you wish to show contempt for someone, you would show it by giving them 30 pieces of silver, conveying to them that, as far as you're concerned, that you're worth only about as much as a dead slave. So these 30 pieces of silver were the price or a sign of contempt. Now, people do things like that today. If you go out to a restaurant, not that we've been able to do that all that much lately, but if you go out to a restaurant, you leave a tip sometimes. We don't do it as much as Aussies, although I was listening to the news this week and they were saying as businesses open, one of the things that we can do is, let's say you go out and you go to a restaurant, it costs $27, round it up to the next $10. That way we're helping out these industries that have suffered for the last number of months. And so, but we practice this whole concept. If you don't think their service was worth it, sometimes we give nothing at all as a tip. Sometimes restaurants have a tip jar out the front, and sometimes you get your change, or you just put some money in there if you think that their service was great. If you don't think their service was great, sometimes you put nothing in. But here's the greatest sign of contempt would be to put 5 cents in the tip jar. And in essence, this is what is happening here with these 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver was this sign of contempt. And so that happens even today. They gave Zechariah 30 pieces of silver, a price of contempt, the price of a dead slave. It's sort of the minimum, what you had to do because that's what the law said. This is fulfilled in Matthew 26, verse 14 to 16. And in the first part of verse 13, the prophet receives another commission. So after playing out this role of the Messiah, God gives him he appears to Zechariah and he gives him another commission. He tells him to take this money, this 30 pieces of silver, and to cast the money to the potter in the potter's area of the temple compound. Then he says, this is the goodly or handsome price that I, Jehovah, was priced at by them. God himself is being sold out for 30 pieces of silver. The expression goodly price here is sarcasm as you read it. It literally means this is what Israel's splendid value of their God is, just the price of a dead slave. So God says, take these 30 pieces of silver and throw it to the potter. the splendid value that I was priced at. And God will be sold out for this very pittance of a price. But this is the price of God, as Israel refers to her, refers to him, the price of contempt. Now, the second part of verse 13, Zechariah carries out this commission. He takes those pieces, he throws them into the potter in the house of Jehovah. So he dumps the money in the temple compound area. The fulfillment of this is recorded in Matthew 27, verse 3 to 10. So when they sold out Jesus to Judas for 30 pieces of silver, the amount was a deliberate amount to show this concept of the price of contempt. See, the leaders of Israel at that time had contempt for Jesus. They didn't believe him to be the Messiah, and so this 30 pieces of silver affirms their attitude. At this point in verse 14, we have the breaking then of Zechariah's second staff, the staff called union or bands. And so we see that the unity of the Jews, this unity that they enjoyed, is destroyed. And so in the war between the Jews and the Romans in AD 66, as I said earlier, there were different factions that were formed among the zealots, and they began to actually fight against each other and to kill each other off before weakening themselves before the Romans. Even destroying, as I said, each other's food supplies, that led to this famine as the city was besieged. Ultimately, it was this civil strife that would send Jerusalem to cause it to fall easily under the weight of Rome as it approached. Now, the purpose of breaking of these union bands was that God might break this family bond between Judah and Israel. And we know that this civil strife, as I've mentioned it, came to pass. The result was that the Jews were scattered, something that Zechariah will bring out later as we look at chapter 13. The 30 pieces of silver that was paid to Judas came out of the temple treasury. Now, the payment that came out of the temple treasury was intended for the purpose of purchasing sacrifices. So these 30 pieces of silver was for the purpose of purchasing a sacrifice. Now, while that was not these Israel leaders' intent, that's exactly what they did that day. They didn't know it, but they played right into the hands of God. They actually purchased a sacrifice, and guess what they purchased? They purchased the final sacrifice for sin. So let's just summarise. Maybe there's been a lot that we've talked about this morning. Let's just summarise it for a minute. Here's a quick summary of these first 14 verses. The first is that Messiah, there will be destruction, and the Messiah will come before that destruction takes place. The second thing is that the believing remnant will follow him. The third thing, that others, including the leaders, will value the Messiah as nothing more than a dead slave. The fourth thing is the consequences. And the people will be given over to the Gentiles, and they will obviously be scattered. And the fifth thing is that Christ is pictured now as the Good Shepherd, as we refer to him and we see in John's Gospel chapter 10, verses 11 to 18. So that brings this segment of Zechariah 11 to a close. And we're left with 3 verses that talks about this foolish shepherd. So God had Zechariah play the role of the Messiah or the true shepherd, but now he wants Zechariah to play the role of the foolish shepherd. So we see that as we come to the end. We come to the end of this chapter 11 of Zechariah. So let's have a look at what he means now, because John 10 talks to us as Jesus being the good shepherd. So we have this contrast now of the foolish shepherd, the one who doesn't care for the flock. So in verses 15 to 17, these last 3 verses, we have the account of the foolish shepherd that Israel will accept. In verse 15, there is again the commission of the prophet. God says, take again the equipment of a foolish shepherd. Now, do you know that the equipment of a foolish shepherd is exactly the same as the equipment of a true or a good shepherd? But he is to play a second role. But this time he's going to play the role of a foolish shepherd, a false shepherd. And he's told to take up these instruments. And the instruments, as I said, are the same, but they are used differently. The good shepherd uses his instruments correctly. The foolish shepherd uses them incorrectly. In verse 16, he's told the reason for this playing this second role and the purpose. He says, for I'm going to raise up a shepherd over the land, that God intends to raise up another shepherd, a false one in the land. Concerning this false shepherd, he says, it'll be one who will not care for the lost. He will have no concern for the flock like the true shepherd did. Neither will he seek the young. In other words, he won't seek those who are scattered, or heal the injured or broken like the true shepherd did, or feed the healthy, which the good shepherd did. But he will eat the meat of all the choice sheep. In other words, he will use the flock for his own self-satisfaction, tearing off their hooves, this verse says. In other words, tearing at the animals so that he can make himself rich at the same time. So the point of verse 16 is that the reason Zechariah is to play the part of a foolish shepherd is that a foolish shepherd will arise from the land and will be accepted and will not do those things that a good or true shepherd does. Now, some people think that this will be fulfilled in the end times. Some think that these verses here are referring to, these foolish shepherd verses are referring to the Antichrist. But it's believed that it has already been fulfilled because it's a part of the things that resulted in the devastation of the land. And that is that the first false Messiah after Jesus was the very first one in Jewish history that ever claimed to be the Messiah. And he died in AD 30. But 100 years later was the first of this long line of false messiahs. And the one that led Israel into the second Jewish revolt against Rome was a guy called Simon Bar Kokhba. His name was later changed. You might know him as Simon Bar Kokhba, Kochba. If you want to know more about him, go and Google it, you'll find it there. But he led this revolt, this second revolt, Jewish revolt against Rome, between the years of 132 to 135 AD. He was a false Messiah, but in fact he was declared the Messiah by Rabbi Kippur and the Sanhedrin. And he was the one who was the false shepherd that has fulfilled these events. And he brought about this second revolt. This whole second revolt failed, causing even more complete devastation upon the land, to the point that Jerusalem, after this time, all Jews are actually cast out of Jerusalem, out of the land, and in fact, Jerusalem becomes off limits for all Jews. Praise God that He is bringing the Jewish people back into their promised land. In verse 17, this very last verse, he says, or pronounces a judgment on the foolish shepherd. He says, "Woe to the worthless shepherd who deserts the flock. May the sword strike his arm and his right eye. May his arm be completely withered and his right eye totally blinded." Bar Kokhba was a false leader that only brought about further devastation and a further rupture between the Jews who believed in Jesus and the Jews who did not. And there is a focus here in this verse upon his right arm and upon his right eye. Probably some of the things that may have happened to Bar Kokhba after or just before he was killed by the Romans. Concerning his arm was completely withered. The arm was supposed to be used to protect the flock, but it didn't. And this corresponds to the staff called beauty or favour, God's protection, God's graciousness. But Bar Kokhba did not fulfill that function of beauty. Concerning his eye, I'll leave it on that other verse there for a second. Concerning his eye, his right eye shall be totally blinded or darkened. And the eye should have been used to watch out for the flock so that they didn't wander off and they didn't scatter, that he would keep them together. And that's the function of the second staff, this staff of union or bands. And neither did Bar Kokhba fulfill that function either. Instead of uniting Israel, he scattered them. So the devastation of the land in verses 1 to 3 that we looked at the start comes because of the rejection of the true shepherd in verses 4 to 14 and the acceptance of the false shepherd right at the end here in these last 3 verses. So that's our summary. You can see it there. The devastation of the land comes because of the rejection of Jesus, the true shepherd, and their acceptance of other false shepherds or false messiahs. Now, all of this history was predicted by Zechariah 500 years before it even occurred. It was prophesied by Zechariah. You know, all of those things have fallen into place and can be trusted. Next week, as I said, we're going to look at further prophecies that are yet to take place. The prophecies about the campaign of Armageddon in the end of times. So we're going to move towards that particular campaign of Armageddon as we look at chapter 12 in Zechariah. And we'll talk more about that next week. So make sure that you tune in next week. Don't miss it. Make sure you join up with us then. You know, God's Word is so powerful. When we read it and we truly understand it, I reckon that most of us, before we read this passage in Zechariah 11, had no real understanding of what was occurring. But as it's explained to us, as we understand history, as we see what God has done down throughout history, and it pieces all together, we can then look forward to what God is trying to say to us will happen in the future. But God's Word is powerful. His plans are perfect. And that's why I want us to stay in God's Word. That's why this series has been so important. He has a plan for this world. You might not see it right at the moment. We're just talking about this coronavirus. We're talking about all these other protests that are occurring. It doesn't matter what they are, but there's so many of them around the world. And all of it is dividing the people. But we're also seeing the nation of Israel return to God as well. All of these prophecies are happening in our time all around us. But God has a plan, that He is sovereign. History affirms this whole thing, that God is sovereign, that He is still in control, that His plans are perfect. But history affirms and declares that God is right every time. God's prophecies aren't just hit and miss. God's prophecies are fulfilled because He is God. So my comment, as we said last week, and I put it on the line a little bit last week, that we are to place our trust in Jesus, the cornerstone. The entire scriptures are written around this Messiah, the Messiah Jesus. Everything before the coming of Christ in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago points to Jesus. Everything since then that's occurred, as we read about it in the scriptures, points and looks forward to the second coming of Jesus. And it's only through Jesus that your and my salvation will come. Acts 4, as I said last week, says salvation is found in no one else and nothing else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. Jesus is everything. Acts 4. Also last week I said this, that now is the time of God's favour. Now is the day of salvation. We live in this wonderful age of grace that God has given to us. You know, we call it the age of the church. It's God's plan for us as Gentiles around the world, and there's a wonderful opportunity, but we don't know when all of these things will come to a completion. We think we might know. There's things that we can see, there's certain markers through the scriptures, but now is the time of God's favour. Why wouldn't you want to have God's favour on your life from this day onwards? Maybe that's you, and all you have to do is put your belief and trust in Jesus Christ. That's all it is. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to pay a price. You don't have to do anything as far as, be good and, you think you can be better than your neighbour, therefore God must love you better than your neighbour. That's the whole purpose of the cross, that Jesus died once and for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, so that we might have eternal life, that our sins can be forgiven. So I encourage you today, if you're listening to this and you haven't had the opportunity to place your trust in Jesus, that's all that it takes. Take the courage to see God's favour, believe in what Jesus has done for you, and follow His word, and watch and pray because He is coming again for His bride. Next week we're going to look at, as I said, chapter 12. Let's have a look at that now. This whole series is Return to Me and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty. And there's this encouragement that as we look at God's words, that we will return even closer to Him and understand His word even more. But next week, Zechariah chapter 12, that's your homework. We're going to look at the campaign of Armageddon and Israel's salvation. So if you've got time, let's have a look at that next week. Let's pray, and then I'll finish up with just a couple of bits and pieces, a bit of housekeeping after that. Let's pray. We pray, our mighty Father God, thank you for sending the true shepherd, a good shepherd, Jesus, Yeshua, the one who is our Passover lamb, who takes away the sin of the entire world, including ours. May we still hear His voice and allow Him to lead us by the paths of green pasture and by the still waters, so that we may discover our rest in these times of evil chaos and disturbance around the world. We acknowledge your overall plan for those who place their belief and trust in you and in your word. Allow your love to touch our hearts so that we may serve you this week, assured that the future is safe and secure in your hands. Help us to listen to our good shepherd Jesus as we live a life in your favour. We go in the blessing of the Lord in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks for being a part of our podcast today, our church online today here at Laidley Baptist Church. And as I said, it's coming closer to where we can gather together. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll have more information that we can share with you, and we'd love to see you all again and back meeting together, hopefully mid-July, maybe could be end of July. So stay tuned to our channel. We'll keep you in touch with all of those things. In the meantime, go to our website, Laidley Baptist website. It's going to appear at the bottom of the screen right now over here. Just have a look at our website. There's lots of resources there. All of our previous teachings on Zechariah is there as well as other messages, sermons and resources. So keep liking us and following us and sharing us and subscribe. It's free. We don't charge anything. Just go onto YouTube and pick it up and learn and get into God's Word. So that's all we need you to do at the moment. But don't forget, it's free to subscribe. So this is Pastor Marshall signing off from the Bap Cave. Stay close to God and His Word this week. And remember the words of God Almighty when He said this. He said, "Return to me, and I will return to you," says the Lord Almighty. It's only Him and through Him that our salvation will come. Signing off now, this is Pastor Marshall. Bless you heaps. See you next week. Bye for now.